Welcome to another Exopolitics commentary, and today what I'm going to be doing is looking at plans by the deep state that go back quite some time to create a Gog and Magog end times war that fulfills biblical prophecy in a number of major religions such as Christianity, the Israeli Bible or the Jewish Bible, and even in the Quran.
You are listening to Exopolitics Today with Dr. Michael Salla, your source for the uncensored truth regarding the human, extraterrestrial, global, and political agenda. Click the like button and subscribe to this channel. And now, here's Dr. Michael Salla.
So what I'm going to do is play you an extract of a video webinar I did back in December of 2024, where I discussed the Gog and Magog war up until that time in terms of the historical foundations for it, who's behind it, and events that had transpired up until December of 2024. Well, since that time, we had the attacks and counterattacks by Israel and Iran on one another, and the United States launching its own attacks in support of Israel. So I want to discuss that in terms of, well, does this mean the Gog and Magog war is actually being stifled, prevented, or does this mean the Gog and Magog war is now reaching a new stage? So I will discuss that at the end of this video clip. But I want to play it. It goes for about 30 minutes. At various points, I may just stop the clip and just jump in and give you some recent updates on what was being discussed at the time. So what I'm going to do now is start playing the clip for you. Now I want to look at the Middle East. I want to look at these plans by the deep state to manufacture war out of nowhere. You know, the deep state, as I said, is trying to manufacture a drone war. Well, another war that they're trying to manufacture is a Gog and Magog end times war. So this is in this figure you see here shows these different lands from Ezekiel chapter 38, section 1 to 6, Gog, Magog, Cush, Phut, Gomer, Togarmah, Meshech, Rosh. Okay, so it shows an alliance of these different states that would wage war against Israel. And that in this war, this would be a kind of end times war where the Messiah would appear. In the Israeli or the Old Testament, they talk about the coming of the Messiah, and that would occur during an end times war when the Messiah would come in and rescue the state of Israel. So, okay, so look at all these nations involved in the Gog and Magog war. Okay, so there are different sources that describe the deep state wanting to manufacture this Gog and Magog war. One of the sources is someone that became a whistleblower in 2010 for the Project Camelot, and this was a whistleblower from the City of London, and the article discussing the testimony of this whistleblower was called the Anglo-Saxon Mission. And so there's the link. You can find that article now on the Project Avalon website. And it talked about this plan to manufacture an end times war in the Middle East involving Israel. So let's see what was in this plan. So in the Anglo-Saxon Mission plan, it said, quote, Iran will be attacked, possibly within 18 months. China will come to the aid of Iran. Nuclear weapons will be used either by Iran or China, with Israel provoking the first use. Much of the Middle East will be laid to waste. Millions will die. So this was in this Anglo-Saxon Mission plan that was kind of hatched back in 2005 in the City of London. Now, clearly, because we're talking about the City of London, we're talking about the British monarchy being involved in that as well. So extraterrestrials would also be involved in this Iran attack plan. So it went on to say, and my own understanding is that there's some sort of malevolent ET alliance at work for 50 years by the UK and US and other Western powers, and this includes Japan. And again, when we talk about a malevolent ET alliance, that's in the context of black projects, and this is an exchange of technologies that's been going on for some considerable time. Well, right there, I just want to interrupt and kind of give you a little bit of an update on what was said at that time. Now, we have gotten information that the negative extraterrestrials have been driven off planet and out of our solar system by the incursion of different positive extraterrestrial alliances. Now, this is hotly contested. Some people say the negative extraterrestrials haven't left at all, that they're still here in deep underground military bases, still pulling the strings, controlling the deep state and their former minions. While others say they have been completely driven off planet, and what's left are the minions, the deep state, and they're kind of fighting a desperate rearguard action. Well, as far as my own kind of research is concerned, and I've consulted multiple sources, what I think has happened is that the fleets of negative extraterrestrials that were once here in our solar system, we're talking draconian reptilians, we're talking Orion Greys, we're talking Dark Fleet bases on the moon, on Mars, in Ceres, that by and large, those different groups have left in terms of their fleets. And the fleets that remained defected, in the case of, say, the German Dark Fleet, that defected to the alliance, to the White Hats. Now, why did this happen? Well, I think it happened because there were successive fleets of highly evolved extraterrestrial civilizations. I think the ones that have been battling it out for a long time, and here we're talking about, say, the Draco Reptilians, the Orion Greys, and the Galactic Federation of Worlds, the Ashtar Command. As far as I can tell, they are primarily fourth and fifth density beings, and they tend to kind of like see things in dualistic terms, good and evil, and so they will kind of like react to things that are happening around them. Whereas the extraterrestrials that came in, they're sixth, seventh, and eighth dimensional beings, and they came in their fleets to observe the transition or the end times in our solar system. And I think the incursion of these positive extraterrestrial groups, some people have talked about them as like the Intergalactic Confederation. Others have talked about just celestial beings, 24 civilizations, many different names, but I think it is probably very accurate that an incursion of highly evolved extraterrestrials at that kind of sixth, seventh, eighth density consciousness level have come in, and they operate at a level where they kind of like record and understand the motivations, the kind of agendas of different groups operating at a fourth and fifth density. And what that does is that it tends to discourage those operating with a deceptive agenda because everything is being recorded. And I think that's why the negatives left. That they realized that this incursion of highly evolved extraterrestrials meant that everything was being recorded. There was a light being cast on everything happening in our solar system. And so if you were acting with an agenda to subvert and dominate, then that was known. And this was something that was in violation of what these highly evolved extraterrestrials wanted, which was that Earth population would be able to choose through free will their own destiny, their own future. So I think a lot of the negative extraterrestrials left. Now, I don't think all of them left. I think the fleets left, and you have, say, the German dark fleets that remain defecting. But there were still deep underground military bases. And so this is where you get into this issue of portals. So the portals enable extraterrestrials to come and go into our planet from all over our galaxy. So even though you might have the fleets of the negative extraterrestrials leaving, and I think they did leave, in the deep underground military bases, I think there were still a lot of negative extraterrestrials active, like the Draconians and Orion Greys, and that they would operate, or they would be able to travel back and forth through these portals. So this is where you get into the whole kind of like liberation of dumbs and portals, because this is what was happening, that you have these dumbs, deep underground military bases that up until recently often were kind of jointly operated between extraterrestrials and, say, negative human groups or compromised human groups, military intelligence groups, and so forth. And so a lot of these bases had to be liberated. And so I think that's what's been going on ever since then. And I think this is an ongoing struggle. I mean, those who say that all the negative extraterrestrials have left and that all we have is a few kind of like deep state minions kind of like left on the planet, I think that is incorrect, because if you look at, say, the example of JP, the army whistleblower I've been working with since 2008, he talked about going to a Pacific space arc where there was this presence of these human actors that had captured a positive extraterrestrial, and that they were manipulating the space arc. They were trying to activate it to create all sorts of mayhem there, and that they had in there, they had a Nordic-looking extraterrestrial that they were in control of. So I think that there is still the presence of a deep state that is working closely with negative extraterrestrials who are able to use portals to enter into and out of deep underground military bases all over the planet. And until those dumbs are all under the control of white hats, then I think you're going to continue to have these negative extraterrestrials coming and going, creating all sorts of problems, because the deep state worships these beings. The deep state worships these negative extraterrestrials, whether we're talking about the Draco reptilians, the Orion Greys, or you're talking about Anunnaki. They're able to come and go using portals. So I think it's very, very complex, and so I think that what we are witnessing now in terms of the Gog and Magog end times war is that while in 2005, or 2002, when that City of London plan was hatched and revealed, subsequent negative extraterrestrials were here with their fleets. But as I've said, the fleets have gone, but nevertheless, you still have some negative extraterrestrials here working with their former or current deep state minions, and they're the ones that are still doing a lot of dastardly things behind the scenes. And I think this Gog and Magog end times war is one aspect of that. So let's resume the video extract I want to play for you. Okay, so they're talking about negative ETs that are involved in black projects, that is deep state run operations, where they have developed advanced technologies that can be used for false flag attacks. So, okay, here's an allusion to the drones that are coming out of the oceans from the deep state that are flying over the United States. These are the kinds of black projects that are a product of this malevolent ET alliance that involved deep state actors and corporations involved with that. Okay, so is there more evidence that there has been this kind of nefarious plan for having an alliance of states in the Middle East be involved in an attack on Iran? And what would precipitate that? Well, what you would need is to have a lot of chaos in the Middle East that would lead to Iran eventually being attacked. That would be part of this kind of end times Gog and Magog war. So there is evidence of that. And here's a very famous clip that many people have cited in the past. This concerns General Wesley Clark, who was a 4-star Supreme Allied Commander of the European Forces, a 4-star general. And in 2001, after the September 11 attack, he went to the Pentagon to talk with some former subordinates who are now generals. So he describes a plan that he was told about back in the time to have 7 Middle East countries, in addition to Afghanistan, attacked and undermined, and that this would eventually lead to Iran being involved in this kind of series of wars. And all of this would play into the Gog and Magog end times war. So let me play that clip for you.
Hello to some of the people on the joint staff who had used to work for me, and one of the generals called me and he said, "Sir, you got to come in. You got to come in and talk to me a second." I said, "Well, you're too busy." He said, No. He says, "We made the decision. We're going to war with Iraq." This was on or about the 20th of September. I said, "We're going to war with Iraq. Why?" He said, "I don't know." He said, "I guess they don't know what else to do." So I said, "Well, did they find some information connecting Saddam to Al-Qaeda?" He said, No. He says, "There's nothing new that way. They just made the decision to go to war with Iraq." He said, "I guess it's like we don't know what to do about terrorists, but we got a good military and we can take down governments." And he said, "I guess if the only tool you have is a hammer, every problem has to look like a nail." So I came back to see him a few weeks later, and by that time we were bombing in Afghanistan. I said, "Are we still going to war with Iraq?" And he said, "Oh, it's worse than that." He said, he reached over on his desk, he picked up a piece of paper. He said, I just got this down from upstairs, meaning the Secretary of Defense office today. And he said, "It's the memo that describes how we're going to take out 7 countries in 5 years, starting with Iraq and then Syria, Lebanon, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and finishing off Iran." I said, "Is it classified?" He said, "Yes, sir." I said, "Well, don't show it to me."
All right, so there you have General Clark exposing the plan to attack 7 Middle East countries. Now, people will say, well, this was in 2001, and it talked about over the next 5 years, these 7 countries would be attacked and undermined, but that didn't happen, right? I mean, by 2006, this hadn't happened. Well, the important thing to keep in mind here is that these kinds of end times wars are event driven. They're not chronologically driven. We think in chronological time. So we think, I mean, he was told back then 5 years, but in fact, these are event driven. So you could not have, for example, Iran being attacked until Syria had been attacked and undermined. And likewise, Lebanon being attacked and undermined, and so forth. So it's event driven. So it's like a series of dominoes. And to get to the next domino in the sequence, you need to have achieved the outcome you desired, which was the complete dissolution and collapse of that country. So this is why it's taken more than 5 years to unfold. But now we have reached a time when this kind of Gog and Magog end times war is on the verge, or could be on the verge of occurring. So in the book of Ezekiel, it describes a little bit more about this. Son of man, set your face against Gog of the land of Magog, and prophesy against him, and say, thus says the Lord God, behold, I am against you, O Gog, the prince of Rosh, Meshech, and Tubal, Persia, Ethiopia, and Libya are with them. So what is being spoken about here is that the Israelite nation will one day face off against all of these groups, all of these other nations that were in this kind of like Gog alliance that would be opposed to Israel. And when the 1,000 years are finished, Satan shall be loosed out of his prison and shall come forth to deceive the nations which are in the four corners of the earth, Gog and Magog, to gather them together to the war, the number of which is at the sand of the sea. Okay, so when the 1,000 years are finished, so we're talking about an extended period of time from this book of Revelation, when this was written, that Satan shall be conspiring to bring about this kind of alliance of nations to take on the land of Israel. And so Satan would be the great deceiver, and he would be the one that would lead the nations of Gog and Magog against the Israelites. Well, the thing is, then the state of Israel didn't exist from around the time of, I think it was 70 AD, when the Jewish temple was destroyed by the Romans, and up until 1949, or was it 47, when the state of Israel was created by the United Nations. So all of that time, there was no state of Israel. But after that time, then this was the key event that made it possible for this book of Revelation to actually be played out. So this raises the very interesting question, was the creation of Israel kind of like part of this deep state plan to manufacture a Gog and Magog end times war? Very interesting question. So Gog and Magog is modern day Russia and Middle East countries. So you can see the alliance of these different countries that make up Gog and Magog, and that Russia was a part of that. Russia, Turkey, Iran make up the lands that historically belonged to Gog and Magog, a multinational alliance that would wage war against Israel in the final days. And so you would also have peoples from other adjoining countries, whether we're talking Libya, Egypt, Iraq, Iran, joining in this end times war. So as I mentioned, this is all event driven. So to bring about this Gog and Magog war, General Wesley Clark talked about 7 nations that would be undermined, and that the 7th nation in that chain of events would be Iran. But the 6th nation, the critical one, that would be a precursor to taking on Iran, was Syria. So this is where we get into biblical prophecy and Syria, or Damascus. Damascus is probably the oldest city in the world right now. It dates back before the Christian era. So in the book of Isaiah, it says, behold, Damascus will cease to be a city and will become a heap of ruins. The kingdom from Damascus and the remnant of Syria will be like the glory of the children of Israel, declares the Lord of hosts. So this was part of the sequence that the deep state had in mind for bringing about the Gog and Magog war. You destroy Syria, you lay waste to the city of Damascus. Syria would become a mess, just like Somalia, the Sudan, Libya. That would be a kind of mess, and out of that chaos of those countries would emerge these forces of chaos, Gog and Magog. Well, as far as realizing this prophecy, what happened was that Russia thwarted that plan. So Russia thwarted that plan on September 30, 2015. So this was about 4 years after the Syrian nation erupted into civil war, that just as as the regime of Bashar al-Assad was on the verge of collapse, Russia intervened. And why did they intervene? There are a number of reasons, but I think part of the reason was that there are well educated and knowledgeable people within Russia that understand what the deep state was doing. They understood the Anglo-Saxon Mission. They understood the sequence of nations that were going to be targeted, as Wesley Clark outlined. They understood the whole Gog and Magog end times war. They understood the role of Satan being the great deceiver and conspiring to create this Gog and Magog end times war. And it's interesting that Vladimir Putin has actually said that the forces of the West, the elites driving the international policies of the West in much of international relations is dominated by Satanists. So he's actually said that.
I just want to jump in here and just kind of like make a brief comment that when it comes to the depiction of the West as controlled by these Satanist groups, that Vladimir Putin identified those forces dominated by secret societies, whether we're talking Freemasons, Jesuits, who operate behind the scenes in manipulating and controlling elites. And that this actually is currently why we are seeing Europe in general, apart from a couple of notable exceptions like Hungary and Slovakia, kind of like lining up to encourage a war with Russia. And I'll talk about that soon with Ukraine. But I do want to say that when the way in which Putin regards the United States, I think he regards the United States as kind of like being divided. On the one hand, you have these Satanists, these global elites that operate through secret societies that have a stranglehold on the media in the United States, the courts, the judiciary, and also on Congress, that tends to be dominated by groups under the influence of, say, George Soros. And that when it comes to the Make America Great Again movement, Donald Trump, this is a counter movement to that. So when Vladimir Putin says that the West is dominated by Satanists, I think what he's really trying to say is that, yes, these are the most powerful groups that control the media, the judiciary, and parliaments in most countries. But there are forces that are opposed to these global Satanists, and he would say that the Make America Great Again movement, or the MAGA movement under Donald Trump, actually is part of that counter movement. And this is kind of like borne out by the fact that there have been multiple sources, and I just did an interview with Gene Decode, who that came out last Monday, but he and quite a few others have talked about Donald Trump being approached by military generals, United States military generals, to run for office to protect and maintain the American Republic, because if he didn't run, these Satanists were going to basically create the implosion, the dissolution of the United States. That these Satanists, their agenda is to kind of like have the United States implode and help China to become the dominant nation on the earth. So Putin is not talking about the current Trump administration as being controlled by Satanists. He's talking about those that are opposed to the Trump administration.
So this all fits in with the whole Gog and Magog end times war, and Russia's intervention in the Syria war prevented the destruction of Damascus and helped the Assad regime retake much of the country. So up until recently, we're talking 2024, November 2024, when you had the collapse of the Assad regime, that for that 9 years, Syria was held together because of the Russian military presence and the help that they gave to the Assad regime to prevent the destruction of the, prevent the dissolution of the Syrian state and the destruction of Damascus. But with the collapse of Syria just over the last month, and the emergence of these radical Islamist forces and the divvying up of Syria between different nations, you actually now have the prerequisite for the final state in that series of 7 states that Wesley Clark outlined, which is Iran, now becoming the target for the deep state. So here's a military expert, Alistair Crook, funny name for a British diplomat. I mean, we want to trust Crook, right? Okay, let's trust Crook. All right, so I think he is a very good geopolitical analyst. Judge Andrew Napolitano is a big supporter of this particular geopolitical analyst, and Judge Napolitano, really, I find him to be a very astute observer of geopolitical events, and he's had a number of experts come on to talk about these events. Eventually, I'm sure he will be interested in exopolitics, but for now, it's geopolitics. But let's hear from Alistair Crook, who you can trust. Trust the Crook.
Middle East now is heading to a clash between these two. Now we have two big powers in the Middle East: Turkey, who has irredentist ambitions right down to Jerusalem, and you have Greater Israel saying, well, actually, Damascus is part of Greater Israel. So, I mean, these two are going to headbutt at this period. I don't know how badly, in what way, but it's inevitable because Turkey is determined. So Israel now has a jihadist state on its borders. That is going to make it very uneasy. Iran is no longer in the direct southern picture, but Iran is still powerful. And you may have a surprise even before Trump takes office from Iran, a demonstration of deterrence from Iran. They are seriously thinking about it. I can't tell you that it's absolutely sure, but I think you will find that they have decided that there needs to be a demonstration of deterrence before Trump takes office on the 20th of January.
Okay, so there you have the analysis of Alistair Crook concerning what's to expect in Syria. Right now, you have Turkey, you have Israel, you have the United States, and you have these Islamic radicals kind of dominating the landscape in Syria, and the Russians having to kind of recuse themselves from the coming conflict. And I think it's very clear that, as Crook says, that it's inevitable that Turkey and Israel are going to clash. Now, to what extent they're going to clash? Will that become a kinetic battle? It could well be. Could well be that Turkey will fund Islamic radicals to attack Israeli interests, and Israel will in turn use proxies and intervene itself to attack all different actors within Syria to create a kind of chaos and devastation in those parts of Syria that escaped the worst of the civil war. And that is particularly relevant when it comes to Damascus, because Israel now views Damascus as on the front lines of Israel's extended territory, that Israel took over some portions of Syria, the Golan Heights, and other areas adjoining Lebanon. And if the city of Damascus was to fall under the control of Islamic radicals, then the Israelis would react. And so that sets the stage for some future conflict involving Damascus. And as I mentioned earlier, Damascus has been prophesied in the book of Isaiah as being laid to waste in the end times when this Gog and Magog war would emerge. So this is all playing out to a script that was, I think, laid out by the deep state for, well, you can actually go back thousands of years. The deep state's been around a long, long time. And eventually this is going to involve Iran.
Just before I continue with this next section here, where I talk about Ukraine, I just wanted to mention that the destruction of Damascus is a key part of this kind of like Gog and Magog end times war. Now, Damascus, the city, as I mentioned, has been largely intact, but right now it's controlled by Islamic radicals, fundamentalists who are being kind of like supported by the West or recognized by the West. But at any time, these Islamic radicals can say, well, Israel has occupied these areas of Syria, and that's illegal, and so we are declaring jihad against them. And so then you have a battle where on the one side you have the new Syrian government with this kind of like Islamic fundamentalist element which is controlling it, which is being supported by Turkey, and many Western countries are kind of like supporting this new Syrian government. But on the other hand, you have the Israeli government that is opposed to that government in terms of ideology and also territorial control. So there's going to be a clash at some time. And if there is a clash, that means that Damascus would likely be attacked and destroyed by Israeli forces battling against this new Islamic regime in Syria. So that would be a critical event in this kind of end times war, this Gog and Magog war, as it plays out. So I'll kind of like talk more about how much of these events need to play out before you can have a next kind of like event kind of like occurring. You know, if, for example, Damascus hasn't been destroyed as predicted in biblical prophecy, does that mean that you then can't go to the next kind of step in terms of like a war between Israel and Gog and Magog? That's an interesting question. But at the moment, Damascus hasn't been destroyed, even though there was that prophecy, and that is kind of like, I think, part of this whole Gog and Magog end times scenario that the deep state is trying to bring about. So let me continue now, where I talk about Ukraine and Russia and how that's part of this Gog and Magog war.
A key player in this whole kind of like Gog and Magog end times war is Ukraine, and this is a map that shows the different parts of Ukraine that voted in elections in 2010, and it showed how the country was pretty evenly split between those that were pro-Western versus those that were pro-Russian. The blue areas over here, so the blue area, this light blue area, this area, all of these lands were populated predominantly by ethnic Russians, and that they all favored good relations with Russia, whereas the rest of Ukraine was predominantly populated by Ukrainians who wanted to establish good relations with the European Union and eventually join NATO. But you can see how the country was pretty evenly split. And so in a situation like that, it would be very easy to contrive a civil war if you got one part of one part of the country, like this part, to kind of like stage a coup, take absolute power, and begin repressing those that had pro-Russian sympathies. And that's exactly what happened in 2014. There was a color revolution, and this led to the civil war in Ukraine, and then the intervention of Russia. Now, I think that the intervention of Russia and the vilification of Putin is all part of this Gog and Magog war, because, as mentioned earlier with those maps I showed you, you had Russia being, that territory of Russia being a key part of this alliance that would wage war against Israel in the end times, that would then be the precursor for the return of the Messiah. So, and who would the Messiah be? Interesting question. So anyway, but we did see this vilification of Putin, Russia, begin in 2014 with the Maidan coup that ousted a pro-Russian Ukrainian president, Viktor Yanukovych, and there were subsequent agreements involving rebel Russians from the Donbass region that weren't honored by the Ukraine. And so that set the scene for Russia's special military operation on February 24, 2022. And that was a preemptive action because the Russians understood that Ukraine was about to launch a military invasion of the rebel Donbass region, modeled on Croatia's 1995 Operation Storm. In short, what was happening was that the Ukrainians were being told by their Western allies that they could impose a military solution on Russia, that they could launch a military blitzkrieg to take over these Russian-supported areas of Ukraine and impose a military solution, that there was no need for a diplomatic solution. There was no need to honor any diplomatic solution, such as the Minsk Accords reached in 2015, that Ukraine could achieve a military solution because it had been supplied with top NATO weapon systems, and that it had been assured that a European Union and United States boycott and sanctions regime against Russia would lead to the collapse of Russia and the kind of replacement of Putin's regime. So the Ukrainians kind of marched into that very eagerly, optimistic that they would succeed, but of course it's been disaster. And what's clear here is that Ukraine has been used as a proxy for this kind of end times war, or World War III, because there were people such as Britain's Prime Minister, Boris Johnson at the time, who would prevent a diplomatic solution between Russia and the Ukraine. That shortly after Russia's military intervention in February of 2022, the Russians and the Ukrainians reached an agreement in Turkey to end the military operation. So they would honor a diplomatic solution to the crisis. But Boris Johnson flew in to Kiev and he scuttled the agreement. He told Zelensky, he said, well, look, we'll back you with as much military armaments as you need. We're going to just heap on sanctions on Russia that will lead to its economic collapse. So just hold tight. You're going to win. And Zelensky and the Ukrainian leaders that supported him bought that line. And of course, what's happened ever since is disaster. So Johnson, I think, very clearly was an agent for the 2005 Anglo-Saxon Plan. And as I mentioned, the city of London was where the Anglo-Saxon Plan was hatched. And who was Boris Johnson? Before he became Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, he was the Mayor of London. He's an agent of the Anglo-Saxon Plan, of the elites that came up with this kind of end times war that would eventually lead to a kind of like an alliance of disgruntled nations that would attack Israel, and that Russia would be a part of that. But now we have the election of Donald Trump, and Donald Trump, he doesn't want to have anything to do with all of this. He wants to end the Ukraine war. He doesn't want to just keep on funding the Ukrainians. He wants to put an end to it. So let's listen to what Donald Trump has to say about ending the Ukraine war.
foreign policy, these crazy wars that we're in. One of the things I want to do, and quickly, and President Putin said that he wants to meet with me as soon as possible. So we have to wait for this, but we have to end that war. That war is a horrible, horrible. The soldiers, the number of soldiers being killed, it's a flat plane, and the bullets are going, and there's powerful bullets, powerful guns. And the only thing that's going to stop them is a human body. They go dead flat land. Nobody's ever seen anything like it. Millions of soldiers have died now. Millions. We're seeing numbers that are just crazy.
Okay, so there you have Donald Trump making it very clear that he wants to put an end to the Ukraine war. And I think the election of Donald Trump is a very significant time marker, because this is why the deep states were so opposed to Trump winning the election, because they know he wants to end the Ukraine war, and the Ukraine war was a critical part of this kind of like end times Gog and Magog war. And so he wants to end it. So the Gog and Magog war isn't happening, and the drone war is not happening. Now, earlier on, I talked about the drones, how there is an attempt to kind of like issue shoot down orders against the drones, but I don't think Trump will allow that. The US military has been told to stand down and not shoot at the drones or the UFOs. So I think this is part of what some describe as an Earth alliance that involves kind of military white hats from different nations working with positive extraterrestrials, and they understand what's happening as far as the drones are concerned. So they're being told to stand down, that they don't want a drone war. Nor is a Gog and Magog end time war going to happen anytime soon, because the deep state has been trying to manufacture this, but Trump wants to put an end to the Ukraine component of that. And we'll see what happens with Syria.
Right. So that's the extract I wanted to play for you. But the important takeaway here is that the deep state, going all the way back to that City of London plan, the Anglo-Saxon Plan, they wanted to create a Gog and Magog war. And so there were different events involved in that. One was, of course, the collapse of Syria, which we have seen, and that's kind of like opened up for that final state of those seven to be attacked. Now, the thing is that as far as Ukraine and Russia is involved, the plan of the deep state was to have Russia defeated militarily. That was the goal, and that's how they armed the Ukrainians, and not only armed them to the hilt with the latest weapon systems, but also impose these what would have normally been considered to be crippling economic sanctions. But the sanctions didn't work. Russia was able to survive the sanctions regime from the West, especially from the European Union, and its economy has grown. So that was a pretty big development, because now with Russia being able to withstand the pressures thrown at it through the economic sanctions regime from the European Union nations, from the United States, and also being able to withstand the attack from the Ukrainians and actually achieve military success on the battlefield, that the Russians really have been able to prevent what would have been another key aspect for the Gog and Magog war, which would have been chaos in that area of the world, especially when it comes to Russia. As far as Ukraine is concerned, I mean, Ukraine is undergoing kind of like chaotic times, but it still is a kind of functioning state. But definitely, I think that the deep state wanted to create a situation whereby that whole area, especially with Russia, imploded, and therefore you have the kind of like millions of people, especially the Muslim population of southern Russia, kind of like joining in this Gog and Magog end times war that would be contrived once you had Israel involved in a war with the final of those 7 states, which is Iran. So this takes me to the attack by Israel on Iran that occurred on June 13. Now, everyone I'm sure watching this is familiar with Israel launching what it described as a preemptive attack to prevent Iran developing nuclear weapons. And many people point out, well, Iran has declared that it is not developing nuclear weapons, that its supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, actually has a fatwa prescribing the development of nuclear weapons. But nevertheless, the Iranians enriched the uranium levels, or the uranium that they have in their possession, to a 60% threshold. And you only need uranium enriched to 5%, or more exact, I think it's 3.5%, to use uranium for peaceful nuclear energy purposes. But if you want to develop nuclear weapons, you have to enrich it to 90%. And so the Iranians kind of like adopted this position where, like, okay, we're not developing nuclear weapons. Our supreme leader has said no to that, but we are going to still enrich uranium to this level of 60% because it's our right to enrich uranium to whatever level we want, because we're going to use it for peaceful purposes and we're not going to use it for warfare purposes. And so this is where you have a debate. From the perspective of the Israelis, this was not an unprovoked attack at all. This was provoked because Iran has enriched uranium to 60%. It has secret uranium or nuclear facilities all over the country, and so therefore Israel needed to attack. Otherwise, if Iran was able to continue its policies, eventually it would reach that critical threshold of 90% uranium enrichment, which could be very easily converted into a weapons-grade uranium for use in nuclear weapons. So on June 13, Israel launched, I think it was 200 airplanes against Iran, attacking its various nuclear facilities and military facilities, and also attacking and taking out Iranian military leaders. And then the following day, June 14, Iran launched its counterattack, and that's when you have just barrages of ballistic missiles being sent against Israel, attacking Israel's kind of military facilities, scientific nuclear facilities, and so forth. And that kind of went on for close to 10 days, where Iran and Israel just kind of traded blows. Iran kept on responding to the Israeli air attacks and drone attacks with their ballistic missile attacks. And so both countries were suffering a lot of devastation because of that. And then on June 22nd, the United States launched its attacks, pardon me, on key Iranian nuclear facilities. So the United States used B-2 bombers and Tomahawk missiles from nuclear submarines to attack these 3 bases. The Fordo base, which was where the B-2 bombers dropped these bunker buster bombs. I think it was half a dozen uh, uh, that was dropped by each B2 or altogether on Fordo. And then you had Natanz facility, which also had bunker buster bombs dropped on it, as I recall. And then the Isfahan facility was where they had Tomahawk missiles launched. Now, what happened next is where I think we have something that is of great significance when it comes to the Gog and Magog end times war, because you had Israel and Iran fighting against one another, launching wave after wave of attack, and if that just continued unabated, then that could have easily sucked in regional actors into it. Like the United States was already involved in supplying weapons to Israel, and then the United States attacked these nuclear facilities. And so this could have easily escalated into Iran being supported by its regional allies in a kind of like expanding war against Israel and the United States. But what happened was that soon after the US attacks on Iran, which were kind of telegraphed so that the Iranians would remove a lot of their manpower and some critical infrastructure, and thereby kind of like give the Iranians an opportunity to respond in a symmetric way, whereby the United States could say, well, we achieved our goal. We are no longer going to participate in offensive operations against Iran, and Iran could save face and say, well, we struck back at the great devil, and we implemented massive damages on their military bases in Qatar and so forth. I mean, so both sides would be able to kind of like claim that they had achieved victory. And then what happened was that Donald Trump put pressure on the Israelis to reach a ceasefire with the Iranians. And so that's what happened. That on June 24, 2 days after the US attacked Iran, the Iranians and the Israelis agreed to a ceasefire. Now, this is where we get into the whole Gog and Magog end times war, because what I think happened was that Trump worked with the white hats in the US military and with white hats in Russia and China and even in Iran to kind of like bring about a solution to this Israel-Iran war, whereby you prevented its expansion and thereby prevent the creation of this Gog and Magog end times war. And so the way in which this war ended, with the US attacking Iran on June 22nd, and then there being a ceasefire 2 days later, and Iran was being encouraged to accept the ceasefire by Russia and China, both of whom were in dialogue with the Trump administration. The Trump administration was telling the Russians and the Chinese, look, we don't want this to expand. We want to stop this, and let's kind of like bring this to an end. And so the Chinese and the Russians worked with the Iranians to ensure that this war would be brought to an end, and the US was able to convince the Israelis to bring an end to the war. So on the surface of it all, you can say, well, the United States stopped this war from expanding into a regional war that could then have become this Gog and Magog end times war that could have led to the use of nuclear weapons and more regional actors coming in, as described in the Anglo-Saxon Mission, where there were going to be millions of people dying, and there would have been the use of nuclear weapons, that Trump's intervention and kind of like actions put an end to this, because it was coordinated with other major states that were opposed to the deep state trying to bring this about. So this is where we need to stop thinking in pure geopolitical terms, which is where there's a lot of people, if you look at, I mentioned Judge Andrew Napolitano, his geopolitical analyst, Alistair Crook, and then you have a whole succession of others, such as Colonel Douglas McGregor, Alex Mercurius, Scott Ritter, many others that think in strict geopolitical terms, that, it's, you got the US, you got Russia, you got Iran, all with their distinct interests and all fighting against each other, that we need to stop thinking in those terms. What we need to start thinking, in a kind of more the exopolitical framework, which is that what you have here is a global movement of Satanists. This is global elites that try to contrive global events to bring about end times scenarios that fulfill their plans for world domination, population reduction, increasing human misery and so forth, and keeping our planet under strict control. Whereas the White Hats, the Earth Alliance, comprises a cooperation between these different actors that cross national boundaries. So you actually have the Trump administration and his MAGA movement actually working with Russian nationalists and Putin, working with Chinese nationalists and President Xi, who all are combating this same transnational globalist satanic network that manipulates populations through legislatures, through control of the media, by blackmail, using compromised politicians and public figures and corporate officials and so forth. That this is a global war. And you got to think globally, or you got to think exopolitically. On the one hand, transnationalists that are controlled by these Satanists, who themselves are working with negative extraterrestrials, especially those in these deep underground military bases, who are able to come and go using these advanced portal systems. And then on the other hand, you have the White Hats working with the Trump administration, Putin and Xi, and positive extraterrestrials like the Galactic Federation of Worlds, the Ashtar Command, to bring about a Star Trek future. Now, I think of the two alternatives. The Star Trek future is by far the better alternative for humanity, and so that's why I have supported it in the past. But I just did a webinar where I pointed out, along with some guests, George Cavassalis and Sarah Bresme-Cosme, some of the dilemmas of a Star Trek future. So that's definitely something that we need to keep in mind. So if you're interested in that, just go to my website, exopolitics.org, and look at past webinars, and there you'll see a description for Dilemma of a Star Trek Future, Challenges for Human Sovereignty, which has just come out. Now, as far as this kind of like cooperation between Trump and Putin and Xi, to bring about a kind of speedy end or ceasefire to this war between Iran and Israel, the deep state is trying furiously to stir up the war again. It's saying, it's using leaked documentation from someone working with the deep state, saying, oh, well, these attacks that Trump waged or launched against these Iranian nuclear facilities, they were ineffective, that all of the nuclear materials were taken out well in advance, and that these bunker busters didn't destroy everything there, so that the conflict will have to resume again at some point. Now, I think that is really an attempt by the deep state to rekindle this conflict. Now, will they succeed? What we are in the midst of now is an information war, where the deep state are using their resources, compromised politicians, the mass media, the legacy media, to make it look like, well, Trump's attacks on these nuclear facilities didn't achieve anything. Israel will have to go to war again, and in the US has to decide whether it's going to support the heroic Israelis in kind of putting to an end forever this very dangerous Iranian nuclear program, or whether the White Hats will succeed and say, look, Iran's nuclear program has been stopped, it's been thwarted, it's been put back by years, and we're going to reach an agreement through diplomacy to put an end to this conflict for all. And I think that will basically nullify the Gog and Magog end times war. So personally, I think the Gog and Magog end times war has been thwarted because the White Hats, the Earth Alliance, understand that all of this is event-driven, and that they have prevented the destruction of Damascus, they have prevented the dissolution of Russia, and they have prevented the expansion of this Israel-Iran war into a major regional war, sucking everyone in. So I think the White Hats are very much are succeeding in what they're doing. The Earth Alliance has been successful in thwarting all of these events, these destructive events, but nevertheless, the deep state is going to try to continue to bring about some kind of end times event. So even though the Gog and Magog war has been thwarted, they may go ahead and bring about this kind of this messianic end times event where the Messiah arrives, but the Messiah actually is not who we think. It is actually some kind of cloned AI being that may look like an angelic human, that may have the DNA of Jesus, but in fact it is something else altogether. Now, will the deep state go forward with that? It's their next card that they have, because I think everything else that they've tried, destruction of Syria, they've destroyed much of Syria, but they haven't destroyed Damascus. They haven't led to Russia's dissolution and chaos there, and of course the Israel-Iran war has been stopped from expanding. So the deep state still has some cards to play. Personally, I think the Gog and Magog end times war has been thwarted. We don't have to worry about that, but there is still a chance that the deep state will kind of implement elements of it, such as this end times messianic event involving a cloned AI extraterrestrial that arrives, and that the deep state through the mass media tries to sell as the Messiah who is here to bring about peace and so forth. So we'll see if that happens. Well, that's it for this Exopolitics commentary. Thank you for watching, and I look forward to doing this again with you next week.
You have been listening to Exopolitics Today with Dr. Michael Salla. Please remember to like, share, and subscribe to this channel. Join or start a conversation in the comments. Take the time to explore the vast library of best-selling books, webinars, and podcasts by Dr. Salla. Visit exopoliticstoday.com.